It's an honor again to speak with you. I wanted to say that a few years ago, you've heard this, but I want to say it for our viewers, that a few years ago when I was getting myself familiar with the Christian apologetics and getting my feet wet, basically, I started the very first book that I started with called Ancient Evidence.
Oh my.
For the life of Jesus.
That's
you know how many times I've glued this book together so it doesn't fall apart.
Really? 1984, if I remember.
Yes, exactly.
What is that? That's 30 years ago.
Almost 40 years ago. Yeah. So I was born in 1981.
84, 16 years. Right. 16 and 23. 1 year short of 40. You're right.
Exactly.
You're right.
So, I mean, I don't think this book comes under this. It is no longer available in the market. I mean, you have to find it on eBay or on Amazon. And I was lucky enough to find it. I think the newer edition came out under different time.
The book The Historical Jesus is that book plus about 100 more pages.
Exactly.
And it's still in print.
Exactly.
And it does very well. So apparently a lot of people are using that for textbooks. And what I like about that green one there is that it looks like an academic cover. And that woodcut there is from Albrecht Dürer, the famous German. You can see you can see his initials AD in the picture.
Yes.
And he's a famous German. He was doing his thing a little later, but back with Michelangelo and Leonardo and who's the third guy left out? Dürer. He belongs in that group, but who's the other one? Raphael. So those four guys, and they put that cover on the book, and I love it. I love the academic look.
Yes. So, I mean, as you mentioned, this was published in 1984. So I'm assuming you started the project a couple of years before that. Am I right? Yeah.
Probably 82, 83. And I probably have an essay or two in there that I wrote well before that.
Exactly. So, I mean, I think life is a very strange phenomenon that you never, in your wildest dream, you never thought that 40 years later, you're going to talk to a person who was born in 1981, the year that you're working on this.
Actually, my students tell me the same thing. So I'm kind of used to it. So even now, when I introduce myself or when we start class, PhD class, I'll say, well, I started work on the resurrection in the 1960s. I wrote my dissertation in 1975, and then I go, I know, you weren't even born those days. So that's what I say to my PhD students.
Exactly. So in my opinion, this book is not only a good starter book, but I think it's a very a complete work about Jesus' life, deeds, and death and resurrection. But I was going to ask you, what caused you back in the 80s to write a book such as this? Did you feel that something like this was missing that addresses everything about Jesus?
Yeah, well, something was missing in my life. That's how it started. I often tell, I went through almost 20 years of doubt. The first 10 more seriously, and the last 10 a little spottier. But my 20 years of doubt were bookended by the deaths of the two most important people in my life. So I often think that the death of the first individual a few years later caused me to start questioning my faith, sort of like, will I ever see them again kind of questions. And I started studying and I was really critical. I would debate with Christians. I was a Christian, but I wasn't happy the way average Christians, as you described, weren't always up on what they believed, and they were easy to debate because they didn't really know what they were talking about. And so it made me upset that people couldn't answer my questions. So I figured, well, I'm going to have to, find my own answers. So a lot of people said, hey, check this answer out, check that answer out. Here's a good evidence for Christianity. And I studied them, and some of them I thought were zeros. Some of them I thought were pretty good, but I didn't think they could bear the weight of Christianity. Then one day I was reading a book, very simple book, and the book said, if God raised Jesus from the dead, then Jesus had to be who he said he was, because only God could do that, and he wouldn't raise a heretic. And I thought about that. I thought, that's brilliant. That makes sense. And for what I can think of right away, it seems to be able to hold the weight of Christianity. So I dug into a study of the resurrection at that point. And so sometimes I'm interviewed like this, and people will say, well, you're a good guy. I'll bet you did this because you studied the resurrection strictly to help people with their doubts. And I just chuckled and I said, no, I wish I could say that, but I studied this to help me with my doubts. And later, years later, I've written 3 books on doubt. Years later, years later, it's helping people with their doubts, but that's not the way it started.
So I mean, are you saying that what helped you overcome your doubts was your research and study, and this is something that you value in the Christian life?
For sure. 2 things really helped me. The resurrection, easily, but then I learned that there's different kinds of doubt. And the most common kind is not the kind that says, give me more evidence. The most common kind is emotional doubt. It's doubt that says, I'll give you examples. What if I'm not saved? What if I think I'm a Christian, but when I get to heaven, Jesus uses his left arm and says, depart from me, I never knew you. Then what would I do? It's too late to do anything. How can I be sure now? Or if God's alive, how come I don't get too many answers to prayer? So most doubt is emotional doubt. So the second thing that helped me, resurrection has always been the big one. But secondly, when I was in college, I did not like psychology. I did not like studying psychology, but it was required. And I had to go back to school, and I studied advanced psychology and took a little diploma in cognitive therapy, which is a hot kind of counseling today, secular and religious, because I had to somehow see, you could tell the emotional doubters a bunch of evidences for Christianity, and they'd go, oh, that's fantastic. You've really helped me. And a week later, they're talking to me again going, it's come back, it's come back. So I realized that as strong as the resurrection is, you can't use the resurrection to cure cancer. You can't use the resurrection to stop an anxiety attack. I mean, there are ways to apply things, but they need some medicine, or they need to learn a process by which they can deal with anxiety and depression. So the resurrection plus helping them with their emotions, that has been the overall 1-2 punch for me with doubters. And I wish somebody had stepped up and chewed me out and told me I was thinking like an idiot. And when I began my doubt, I wish they came up to me and not only gave me the evidence for the resurrection, I had to find out for myself, but I wish they told me how to handle my emotions at the same time.
So now that you have overcome your doubts, I was going to ask you, how certain are you that Christianity is true? Are you 100% certain? Or in other words, does knowing Christianity is true require 100% certainty?
Yeah, well, I teach philosophy. That's my discipline. And philosophers are taught to say, you never say anything is 100%. You never use the word proof, because proof means 100% for some people. So they always say, use the word probability. And in philosophy or in science, all the inductive sciences, you can only be probable. You can't prove scientific theorems. You can't prove scientific experiments. We change them all the time. Look at COVID. I mean, everything's changed. So I would say I definitely sure of Christianity. And I would say highly probable would be the way I would say it. In the green book you held up, that's the way I say it there too.
And so you leave some room that you might be wrong. Is that correct?
Well, whether you leave room or don't leave room, it's always possible that we're wrong. That's always that's just the world we live in. I mean, to give you a silly example, you could be married to somebody for 25 years, happens all the time in the world. You're married for 25 years, and you're deeply in love and you assume they are, and all of a sudden they let you come home from work and there's a note on the table. I haven't been very happy lately. I'm leaving you. Hope you have a good life. And you never say the person again. What I mean is, there's an example of being 100% sure of my marriage and being 100% wrong. So those things happen. But I think that's not a situation for the Christian to worry about. I think Christianity is true, hands down. And I'll tell you this, compared to any of the world's religions, no other religion has a prayer of keeping up with the resurrection in terms of evidence. I mean, just to give you the few of the wildest comparisons, let's say Zoroaster from Persian religion. Zoroaster's religious writings are not written down, at least not systematically, not written down until 1,000 years after he died. Well, how do I know that's what he taught 1,000 years later? I mean, America's not even 1,000 years old. Where are we going to be 1,000 years from now? Well, what happened to, the Zoroastrians in 1,000 years? Here's another one, Buddha. I've got a Buddhist source on my shelf. The guy's a PhD and he's a Buddhist, and he starts his book like this. He says, we Buddhists don't have the data that Christians have. He says they have the words of their Lord, we don't. They have the words of those who studied under the Lord and the next generations after that. We don't. We don't have any of this. He's editing in this book the best, what he thinks are the best Buddhist sources. And he says the writings in this book are 600 to 800 years later, and Christians have it immediately. That's how he starts. The Upanishads in India, which are often compared to the Gospels in terms of importance, the earliest copy of the Upanishads is 1,800 years after writing, 1,800 years. And the Bhagavad Gita, Hinduism, Krishna, if Krishna lived, and I'm not doubting that, that's what Hindu scholars say, if he lived, this earliest source is 4,200 years later. And we not only have Paul's first letters from 20 years after the New Testament, we have the early creeds, which we'd have to explain to somebody, but the New Testament is filled with these early creeds that even critics believe come from the 30s AD. So there's no gap in Christianity. So if we're talking evidence, I'll give you a secular example. The earliest biographies of Alexander the Great, we have them from his time, but I'm sorry, we don't have them. They wrote them from his time, but we don't have them. We may have them someday, but they're lost now. The earliest biography of Alexander we have is almost 300 years after he was born. And from what I told you, you can tell 300 is really good. But his best sources are almost a half a millennium after Alexander died. That's secular. And if people don't say, critics like to say, well, Jesus supposedly said, but when they talk about Buddha or Alexander, they talk like this. Well, Buddha said, Alexander said, and back to that Buddhist text, the Buddhist author with the PhD, he said, we do not know what Buddha taught. We do not know what Buddha taught. So that's pretty bad. So if someone wants to say, are we sure? Yeah, and I'll tell you the belief in things like intelligent design, fine-tuning, God's existence, afterlife, with their death experiences, those topics, which a lot of different religions believe. The Kalam argument, which may be the best one for God, is a Muslim argument in the old days, a Muslim argument. So they can be shared across religions. I mean, other people will claim them. But what they all agree is atheists and naturalists are wrong.
Exactly.
And so you could get me going forever, but I'm saying I don't talk 100% because you can't even say that about philosophy.
But compared to other, compared to other religions and worldviews, Christianity, hands down, is
just from history alone. Just from history alone, highly likely. In fact, two of our best known philosophers, if you've ever studied Bayes' theorem and how it works, it's a scientific theorem for how you judge inductive data.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both very well-known philosophers. And one of them, the lower one, decided that the resurrection was 97% probable.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one, the second expert, told the first expert, "You're a little low." He said it's 99.99999.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's what if that's what we mean by totally sure, then we are totally sure.
Exactly.
But
so
now, if you follow what those two guys say.
Mm-hmm. So now that we're talking about history, I mean, the Jesus' resurrection, apart from being a miraculous event, it's a historical event. And I think we are so blessed that God gave us those historical elements for us to investigate. But my question is, because we want to put our faith in this thing, and that will impact our worldview, our entire life. So how can we trust history? I mean, historical methods, and how reliable are our findings so far? I mean, can we trust what we find through history?
What if I gave you some comparisons? I used one earlier about the guy who was totally convinced his marriage was great, and his wife left him immediately. That happens. Okay, here's another example. When somebody gets married, let's use the two examples I just gave you, 99.999 and 97. Are we 97 and 99.9999% convinced, husbands and wives, when they say I do, are they that convinced that their marriage is true, in heaven, so to speak, will never break up? We take vows that say, till death do I part. Am I 99.999 and 97? We'd say, oh, no, it's got to be less than that. Well, then you can be more sure of your faith than you are of your marriage. And most of us don't have any question about our marriage. And an awful lot, I think every Christian should say, but I would think most people should say their marriage is the most important non-religious thing in their life. And they're not 97 or 99.999. So it's very, very reliable. It's just that I don't say 100. When I'll give you another example. We have a sick child, and we give them penicillin for an ear infection. We're very worried if they have 105 temperature, and we want that temperature to drop, and we want them to be healed. But I'm telling you, I don't know what the provenance is of penicillin, and we're finding all kinds of things about drugs not working the way they should now. It's got to be under 90%, and we trust it like crazy because our child's life is in the balance. Well, the resurrection is better than that. So I think the resurrection is as good as anything we can ask for in life.
Okay. I want to ask you about the power of testimony. From time to time, From time to time, I hear this question from Iranian atheists, because atheism is rising in Iran. And then we have a lot of people inside Iran, because of the experience they have had in the past 4 decades with the Iranian regime. They're kind of fed up with God. So, but I hear this from them when I talk about the resurrection of Jesus. They talk about testimony, and they say, do you really think that people's testimony from the first century has any value and is persuasive enough to make us draw any trustworthy conclusion about the resurrection? How do you know that the eyewitnesses didn't lie? How do we answer that question?
Well, okay, you're asking more than one question. If they want to know, how do we know the eyewitnesses don't lie? I would say the disciples were willing to die. Everybody admits that. Every critic. They admit, and somebody might say, well, how do you know what was in their mind? And I'll say, I'm not going from what I think is in their mind. I'm going from where their feet are going. If they're going into the same city 5 times, if they're going to the same geographical area, let's say southwestern Turkey, if they're going in the same region over and over, and they got beat up once 20 miles away, I mean, we read accounts where people from other towns sent people to the new town Paul went to and beat them up from the other town. So, but if you go back there, you're not lying about this. You'd rather be home with your wife and kids and your job and sitting down at night in an easy chair and reading the paper and watching a ball game. You know, that's what you'd rather be doing. Why are you out there in the, you know, hinterland studying or preaching about Jesus? Because you believe it's true and you want to see other people come. What about your wife and children? Well, they're back home. Why aren't you with them? Because I consider preaching huge. Why? Because I consider my message true. Why? How can it be true if you stole the body or if you're lying about the appearances? And what's really strong here is that in Galatians 1 and 2, and critical scholars accept this, critics believe this, even atheist New Testament scholars will tell you this is true. Paul went to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. We can date that. If the cross is 30 AD, he went to Jerusalem in either 35 or 36 AD. Okay. Depends on whether you believe he became a Christian 2 years later or 3 years later, which is the unanimous view. So 5 to 6 years after the cross, Paul goes to Jerusalem and interviews Peter and James, the brother of Jesus on the first visit, and Peter, James, and John on the second visit. Nobody in Christian history is more influential than Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. They're the most famous Christians, best known. And 3 of them, we have first century martyrdom accounts, and all 3 of them are non-biblical. All 3 of them. Okay. So they told Paul, he gave them what he was preaching. He specifically says that. I gave them my message, and they all said it was true. So if I want to know, how do I know their memories are true? You go to the guys who were there and saw the risen Jesus. And that's what Paul's doing. And they told him it's true. I can accept the testimony of those who are willing to die for this message. And 3 of those 4 died according to non-biblical sources. They died for their faith. I can trust their message.
So aren't people from different religion are willing to die for their faith? Like Muslim people are willing to die for their faith?
Yes, there's no problem that missionaries and other religions, here's the difference. They're doing the same thing Christians are in one way and not in another way. The way they're doing the same thing Christians are is they really believe the message they're teaching. Let's say somebody's teaching Krishna in an airport and giving out copies of the Bhagavad Gita in an airport. They could be living for Krishna, and that source they're giving away is 4,200 years after he died. And most Hindu scholars, I understand, say Krishna probably never lived, but they don't say that. They give those books out. In other words, like Christians, they believe it's true. Unlike Christians, here's 2 things. Unlike Christians, they don't have the data to back it up. There's no historical data to back up Krishna or Buddha. Like the Buddhist guy said, we don't even know what he taught. No, Zoroaster 1,000 years later, we don't have the sources. So they both sides are convinced it's true, and that's why they're willing to die. I don't take that from them. They think it's true, and a lot of guys are willing to die for their families. And so they believe their families are, they believe they're in love. They love their kids. They believe their religion. But Christians have all this evidence. They have none, according to the Buddhist writer I quoted. They have none. And secondly, they don't have a resurrection. They don't have a resurrection. We do, and a resurrection is everything, because the resurrection tells me I could be going to heaven if I say I do, if I marry Jesus, so to speak. So when I commit my life to Jesus, I'm on my way to heaven by virtue of the resurrection. But A, they don't have any evidence for their faith, and B, they definitely don't have a resurrection. But yeah, they die for what they think is true. Sure, a lot of people do. Political people do. I'm sure in Russia in 1920, in the revolution, I'm sure there are atheists who gave their lives for atheism. All you got to do is believe it real strongly. That's not the point that the disciples did that. The point is, they were willing to die for their faith, but their faith involved the resurrection. It's the center of their faith. Nobody else can say that.
Okay. So now that you were talking about resurrection, that reminds me of And I think this is a new term for our Iranian viewers, 5 minimal facts that you talk about in your writings. And I was going to ask you, was that your invention? And by invention, I mean, were you the first person who put together these 5 existing facts about Jesus' resurrection?
As far as I know, what is called the minimal facts argument is mine. And I have used 3, I've used 4, I've used 5. Right now I'm using 6. And yeah, I mean, even atheist New Testament scholars will admit these 6 facts. Bart Ehrman says that. So here's how it came about. I was in my doubts. I was having my doubts. I was doing a master's degree, so I was still doubting like crazy. And I was sitting in an easy chair in my house one night, and I thought, how do I know that the resurrection isn't just a myth? It's just a feel-good myth. And I sat down in a chair. I still have the notes I wrote, and they're dated. I sat down in a chair, and I said to myself, what if the New Testament's not inspired? Okay. What if the New Testament's not even reliable? Okay. What if the New Testament is like my professors at school say it is? A nice book, but historically garbage. What if that's all it is? Are there enough facts that we all agree on? For example, there can be an ancient book about Buddha that's way too late to be true, but or maybe you know, Homer or Odysseus. That's mythology, but we can pick out things that are true in there. There really is a coast of Africa. You know, was there a Trojan horse? There was really, you know, and we can pick out facts even in fictional books. So I said, okay, if it's not inspired and it's not reliable, according to my professors, do I still have enough facts to show that it's true, the resurrection is true? And I sat down and I made a list of what I could know if my atheist professors were correct. And they gave me enough evidence. I wrote it down on a sheet of paper, and I had way more evidence than I needed. And then I wrote at the bottom of the sheet, I flipped it over, I'm still writing. And at the bottom of the sheet, I wrote, I said, if somebody is even more skeptical than these guys, I will reduce some of these facts and use their list, and I still think I can disprove the myth theory. And I wrote that on a sheet, and it's in my file cabinet. So yeah, I went through it, and that's how the minimal, I tell people that night, for me anyway, my version, the minimal facts argument was born, me asking the question of how I can answer my doubts, but using the atheist New Testament's facts. And I got to be clear, when I say using the scholars' facts, I mean scholars who are accredited scholars. They have, for example, they have terminal degrees like doctor's degrees in relevant fields like theology, New Testament, archaeology, classics, philosophy, history. If they have PhDs in those topics and they're studying this area, then I can cite them. I don't cite the guys who don't have any degrees, haven't gone to school, they believe Jesus never lived, but they don't have any good data, they haven't done research. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about scholars who paid their dues, they've got PhDs, and they're going to admit my data. So I wrote the data down, and that's how it started.
So can you quickly tell us what those 6 minimal facts? I mean, I'm used to 5 minimal, but you're saying it's 6.
The 6 I used are number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. You're almost never going to get anybody disagree with that. Jesus died by crucifixion. Number 2, this one is just as solid. Jesus' disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. I mean, if I said to somebody, here's a Hindu missionary, he thinks Krishna really lived, whether he did or not. What are the chances? Is his belief true? And you'd say, well, yeah, his belief is true, but Krishna didn't live, you know, like that. But you'd give him the fact that he believes Krishna. So that's number 2. The disciples really believed Jesus rose to the dead. Thirdly, they started preaching it immediately. And these words immediately come from, Well, for example, atheist New Testament scholar, the German scholar who just unfortunately passed away a couple years ago, Gerrit Ludemann, he said that the earliest preaching of the gospel happened immediately. That's his word, immediately. So the third one is early. It was preached early. Fourthly, their lives were turned upside down. Again, they went into my example of Southwest Turkey. They went into the same place over and over again, even though they were getting beat up. And they would go right back. Sometimes they went to the same town again. And they founded churches. Paul would be your best example. But there's others. And their lives were changed. That's the fourth one. Bart Ehrman, the well-known North American atheist, New Testament scholar, he says it this way. It's really cute. In one of his books, he says, yeah, the disciples, at least some of them, he said, these disciples thought they saw Jesus. And he said, what happens after that is, and here's his phrase, he said, what happens after that is they turned the whole world on its ear. Mm-hmm. I like that. They turned the whole, so that's what we call change, transformation. Then the last two are the two skeptics who became Christians, James, the brother of Jesus, and Saul of Tarsus, alias Paul, who both believed that they had appearances where they saw the risen Jesus. So
what about the empty tomb? Empty tomb.
Okay. In terms of the evidence, I often call the minimal facts. I often say my minimal facts are 6, and then I add the empty tomb. Mm-hmm. It's not a minimal fact by my definition, but I call it 6 plus 1. And here's why the empty tomb has as many evidences as any of the minimal facts do. But my second definition for the minimal facts is the strictest scholars, even they have to be scholars, specialists. The strictest scholars grant these things. Now, that's not as important as number 1, that they're evidenced. But I like them to agree, because then I don't have to argue for each one. I can argue for each one of the 6 if I have to. In fact, the book I just wrote, where I gave the evidences, on those 6, they average 14 evidences a piece. Mm-hmm. 14 evidences per fact. So I'd rather not argue. I'd rather not establish it. I'd rather go on and have them grant it and use it. But you don't get 90 or 95 or whatever. You don't get that high of agreement on the empty tomb. It's about 80%. I could count the empty tomb as a minimal fact, but I never have. It's close. It's close.
Okay. In your experience debating non-believers, have you ever talked to Muslim scholars or debated any of them?
Yes, not very often. I debated.
I know you debated Antonin Flew.
Yeah, but if you mean Muslims, when I was in England, mm-hmm. I debated. You tell me if I'm pronouncing this correctly. A sheikh, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I called him a Muslim pastor. I forgot what I called him. I think I called him Muslim pastor, and he said, "Hey, no offense, I know what you mean, but I might have said imam." Imam, yeah. And he said, okay. He said, I'm not offended, because that's a common mistake. He said, but let me tell you what a sheikh is. He mm-hmm. said, I am over 7 Muslim, if you want to call them churches, temples. What would the Muslims call them? Temples, churches, what?
Masjid.
Okay, I'm over 7 of them. Mm-hmm. So he said a sheikh is over many of them, and I debated him. Mm-hmm. And he brought another guy with him. He was trained in Muslim theology, and so was the guy he brought. So they were both scholars in Islam. Mm-hmm. And I debated him, and I will never forget what happened. I stood up, and we did a debate on, did Jesus die on the cross, and was he seen afterwards? Uh-huh. Those 2 things. Mm-hmm. I stood up, and I used my minimal facts, and I gave a whole bunch of evidences in my allotted time. And I timed it, and I sat down when I was done. And he stood up, and here's what he said. Most of you here are Christians. So let me tell you a little bit about Islam before I start giving my reasons. We have these 5 ways, and here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's what we believe. And by the time he finished, he had about 2 minutes left. And here's what he said about the evidence for his view. He said, there is no evidence to prove that Jesus did not die on the cross. The Quran says it, but I can't give you any scholarly evidence that he didn't die, and I can't prove that he wasn't raised from the dead. We can't disprove the death or the resurrection, and I have no evidence for the Muslim view of it. And he sat down.
Wow.
And I was copying real fast. Well, I didn't have to copy because he said it about 6 more times in the debate. He said, I have no evidence for my position. Islam is taken by faith, and it's a commitment. And we don't have historical evidence like you guys have, which is the same thing that Buddhist book said. And when it was over, he was real friendly, and he had a British accent, and he was from the Middle East, so he had a strong British accent. It was a Middle Eastern British, but he was very good, and he lived in England for years, and he was very good and very kind, he and his theologian buddy. But he said it over a half dozen times, we have no evidence for our faith and no reasons against your faith.
Exactly.
I thought, why are we doing this?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's the case.
That's what I thought. That's the question that I go to. I mean, as a matter of fact, when I'm talking to Muslim people, like a fellow Iranian people from my former religion, I ask them, how can you historically show, because we have all this evidence that Jesus went on the cross, he died on the cross, and then he rose after 3 days. So what historical evidence you guys have to show that he didn't go on the cross, to kind of defend that verse in the Quran? And they basically, in a sort of like your experience, instead of answering this question, they come back with a different question. I don't want to give you this question.
You're right.
They say, the Christianity that you talk about today, it's not the original Christianity. Paul kind of invented this.
Is that right?
Exactly.
That's not the point. That's not the point, though. The point is, did Jesus rise from the dead?
Exactly.
And if Jesus rose from the dead, I don't want to say something as silly as, I don't care who taught it at first. It's not that bad. But I mean, I wouldn't say it that way. But if we have the resurrection, what else do we need? It's the whole faith. It's the gospel.
Exactly.
And it's the yellow brick road, I say, all the way to heaven. I mean, in the Wizard of Oz, it ends with the Emerald City. And when Christ rises from the dead, heaven is our Emerald City. You know, when you read about the New Jerusalem in Revelation, there are about 1/3 of the verses, and those descriptive verses in those 2 chapters are about different colors, the pretty stones in the base. Well, so it's our own Emerald City. But what the resurrection says, see, in the New Testament, almost 20 times, Christians are told that they will be raised from the dead because Jesus is raised from the dead. So there's a singular argument from resurrection to the Emerald City. And there's a singular argument from the resurrection to the New Jerusalem. It's eternal life. And if they can't disprove it, I have a Muslim book on my shelf by a guy who he's passed away now, but he was a leading Muslim scholar years ago. And he wrote a book called Crucifixion. And it's spelled Crucifixion, crucifixion. And he says in the book, whenever I tell Christians, my book says Jesus didn't die on the cross, they say, your book is exactly to the year 600 years after the crucifixion. And he says, as a Muslim scholar, he says, they're right. They're right. You can't do history 600 years later. But when they say that, and you've already said it, he says, when they say that, I change the subject and I start talking about errors in the Gospels. Exactly. And here's where I say, time out. Let's stop. What if I admit, I don't, but let's say I admit your errors in the New Testament, but you admit my crucifixion and resurrection. Who wins this discussion? So if you're right, I have a book with some errors in it, but I still have a lot of facts in there. And the cross and the resurrection are 2 of them. So what are you going to do with that? If I believe you and you believe me, if we believe each other, I got some problems in my Gospels, which I don't believe that, but I would have problems according to you. but you have to handle the crucifixion and resurrection. Now, well, let's go differently. Why did you guys attack us last year? You know, it's like the subject just changes.
Exactly.
They don't want to deal with that subject.
Exactly, because they don't have anything to offer. But how do you answer this question that Paul invented Christianity? So in your opinion, did Paul or any groups or movement kind of impacted the direction of the original Christianity?
Or it came from mythology or something like that.
Yeah.
In my first volume of my big magnum opus, I have 150 pages on versions of that. So there's an awful lot of material to say that. I will tell you this. These critical guys, the guys with the PhDs who go off on Christianity, they're atheists. Those guys, they do not say that. The scholars don't say Paul invented Christianity.
Okay, so this is for popular audience.
It's a popularized with, and so you say to them, okay, let me ask you, since you're asking me to answer this question, I'll be glad to, but where are your data for telling me Paul founded Christianity? If, for example, I'll just give you one response. If Paul is the founder of Christianity, why did he go up to Jerusalem twice in Galatians 1 and 2 and meet with James and Peter the first time and James, Peter, and John the second time? And you know what Paul calls those guys in chapter 2? This is Paul. Galatians is a Pauline book. Why does Paul say they were the pillars of the church? Not me, Paul. Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and John, they were the pillars of the so-called pillars of the church, not Paul. And who did he go to for his information? Those who were there ahead of time. And he says several times in his epistles, this is based on the prophets, on the disciples, the apostles, on Jesus himself and the apostles. So Paul clearly doesn't say anything like that, but I want to know, why did he go to Jerusalem twice and believe their message of the gospel? Why did he?
Yeah.
If they were boss before he was. That's just, to me, that's whistling in the wind. You're not getting that from any, good source.
Exactly. So I think our time is going to be up soon. I wanted to ask you as a last question, what is there any recent project that you're working on? Should we expect any book coming out soon from you?
Well, I do a lot of things on the side. I just published an article in the Resurrection last week, so I'm still doing some things, but most of my time is spent with this 4-volume work on the resurrection, which I have a contract for. I have a publisher. 2 volumes are done. I'm working on volume 3, and it's 4 volumes. The first volume, it's going to be about on lined paper, a double-spaced manuscript paper. It's 5,500 pages minimum. But the first volume is called Evidence for the Resurrection, and that volume was almost 1,300 pages long. The printed one is already out to look at, not for sale, but for us to look at. And it is just short of 1,100 pages. So there's a lot of information on the resurrection. My website, GaryHabermas.com, of course, www.GaryHabermas.com, Habermas. There's a whole lot of resurrection stuff there. And under my name and my email, if you ever see that, if you go to YouTube and look up my YouTube site, there's dozens of things like this that we're talking about. How do we know Paul didn't invent Christianity? How do we know this, that? On my website and on my YouTube, they can get whatever they want.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Do you have any last words for our Iranian Christian viewer?
No. To me, if Christ was raised from the dead, and the major belief that's true from it is that Christians will be raised from the dead. If that's the main argument, we have it all. I was telling the guy, to paraphrase a little bit, I was telling a guy who was worried just 2 days ago, I said, look, just tell yourself this. Tell yourself, life is hard right now. I'm going through some issues, but Jesus exists. I have a fine family and I'm in love. I can live the Christian life. I can be worried about this or that problem, but everything I really want is true. And believe that and eternity waits for people who say yes to Jesus, and the facts are already there. That's the thing I'd say, that it's not just facts, it's facts with a road that takes you all the way to the Emerald City.
Amen.
If you say yes to Jesus, you know.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Hebbermas. I hope that we can have this kind of conversation in the near future. I know you're so busy, but I'm kind of promising on your behalf to our
Well,
viewers.
maybe when I finish this big manuscript, it should be over in about a year.
Okay.
I'll be doing more of these.
Thank you so much for your time. We'll be
You're
in
welcome.
touch, and thank you.